Well, we continue tonight with our Big Five series, Trust, Truth, and 2019, What to Watch For, the upcoming election campaign. It's part of a new national initiative we're launching at CPAC this week called the Democracy Project, bringing together more than 24 partners to promote democratic literacy and engagement as a public service to all Canadians. All about what's at stake in the upcoming federal campaign in an era of foreign and domestic interference, fake news, and disinformation. Last night, we looked at the key election issues, and later this week, we'll take a closer look at the party leaders, the key election battlegrounds, and the key voting groups. But tonight, we'll examine the threats to our democratic process.
Democracy can't just be about the majority, and good decision-making needs to take into account all sorts of experiences and perspectives and really be in service of all people.
I would argue that actually democracy is more fragile now than it was a generation ago.
Because we receive information from so many different sources, and it's so difficult to judge the veracity of any one of those sources, and the very architecture of our digital infrastructure that's giving us content is opaque and driven by commercial incentives rather than necessarily the public good, I think we're seeing an erosion of that trust in the quality of information in our society.
I think that fundamentally there has been a loss of trust in the democratic institutions that make our societies work, whether it's the free press, whether it's government itself. But as people have felt like they don't trust these institutions, that they are not representative of them, along come politicians who exploit those fears. And at least in America, you know, we see the rise of someone like Donald Trump rising out of those fears.
Well, tonight our focus is on the threats to our democracy. There's widespread agreement in this country that our democracy, not just our elections, are under threat both from outside Canada and from inside too. In a moment, we'll discuss what to watch for, what social media companies are doing to safeguard their platforms, and what you can do to inform and protect yourself from bad actors. But first, let's bring in one of our Democracy Project partners, David Coletto, the CEO of Abacus Data, for some numbers to help frame our conversation. David Coletto, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Peter.
Thanks for coming back in to talk about this as a partner in our Democracy Project and our Big Five series here on CPAC. We're talking about threats. So let's start when we look about the possible threats during the election campaign. Let's talk about where Canadians get their information, first of all. You've been surveying Canadians on all of this. Let's start there. What about their habits and sources? What did you find?
Well, when we regularly track this in our research, because it's such a fascinating shift happening. When you ask Canadians, where do you get most of your national news? And if we split it out, I think the real interesting thing is across generation. Those under the age of 45, those over the age of 45, you get two very different worlds, right? 63% of those over 45 in Canada say television is their source for most of their national news. You could see only 6% of those older Canadians say social media. Right. If you look at those under the age of 45, a very different world. TV is still important to a third of them, but 1 out of 4 Canadians under the age of 45 say social media is where they're getting most of their national news. Aggregators, news websites, radio, less so. Right? That distinction is important. So when we talk about threats to our democracy, threats to the election process, we have to start with the recognition that a sizable number of Canadians rely on social media or non-traditional sources of news to find out what's going on.
Right. So what does that mean? What does that tell us about the role it might play in a campaign?
Well, it means that traditional news sources, while still important, your show, for example, is being watched by a lot of people as a source. There's a generation, a subset of the electorate that first could be increasingly isolated from news, may not know what's going on because they're not watching mainstream news coverage. Right. But two, they're open to being influenced, interfered, persuaded with information that may not be true or maybe coming from external sources trying to influence our election.
All right, let's talk about where those threats might come from. You talked about external sources. Let's talk about interference in the campaign and election process. You asked about foreign influence. What did Canadians tell you?
Well, this is the first time I've been covering. This is the 6th federal election I've done polling related to, and I've never, had these questions on a survey, which shows you how different the world is today, right? When we ask Canadians, how likely is it that you think a foreign government will try to influence our upcoming election? A majority of Canadians say it's either very likely or somewhat likely to happen, right? The rest are saying, it's not too likely, or 8% say not at all likely. But the fact that more than half the country is first aware or thinking about the fact that this might happen, and two, saying it might happen, I think is a fascinating shift in our perceptions. And I think a reflection that Canadians and our conversation about this has broken through, and I think Canadians are aware of this as a possibility.
It'd be interesting to see what happens those numbers as the campaign goes along, because to my mind, 40% of people who think it's not likely or not very likely or not at all likely that there'll be foreign interference, that sounds like a problem, because if you're not ready to see the problem, if you don't believe it's going to be there, I think the odds are higher that you won't see it. You won't figure out where the influence is coming from because you don't think it's going to happen.
Being aware,
something to watch
allows
for.
you to be more vigilant, right? Yeah.
Okay. So what about the next result? I found them very intriguing. So which countries Canadians believe the foreign interference might come from? I was really surprised to see this.
Well, I mean, given that last weekend we had the Mueller report come out and the role that Russia might play, you'd suspect Canadians would be suspicious of Russia, and they are.
Right.
They're also suspicious of China.
Right.
But they're just as suspicious as our neighbors to the United States. When we ask people, to what extent are the following countries a threat in trying to influence the upcoming election? As many Canadians say, the U.S. is a high threat of influencing our election, as do Russia. Now, we have to keep in mind, we said influence. It's not to say that they're going to interfere or try to change the result or cause damage, but I think there's a recognition, how geopolitics works, that the United States, as much as China or Russia, are going to want to make sure that the government that's elected in Canada is as friendly to the United States as it ever was. And so it's really interesting. And the comparison point is, I used the UK, for example, right? Another global power. Very few Canadians think the UK is going to try to meddle or influence an election. But the fact that Russia, China, and the United States are perceived to be about the same level of threat shows that for many Canadians, they see us kind of being in the middle and perhaps a pawn in some global geopolitical drama playing out between particularly China and the United States.
Let's turn to safeguarding, questions of safeguarding the election, the level of trust Canadians have in that. Let's start with the federal government. What are Canadians telling you?
Well, it's actually, I think the federal government gets pretty good marks, how confident Canadians are that they're going to be able to prevent interference in our election. 12% are very confident. Most Canadians aren't very confident the federal government can do very much at all, so we give them some credit. But 54% say somewhat confident. And in a lot of things that we do research on, there's not this level of confidence in a lot of other things. So I think for the most part, Canadians recognize that the federal government is aware of this, they're doing things, and they're confident that they're going to be able to do something about it. But there's still a sizable group, almost 30%, who say, I'm not that confident. And so it's something to watch again as we get closer and closer to the election. How do our institutions, from the public's perspective, protect us and our election and our democracy from interference? Okay, let's talk about maybe the bad news now, and that's when it comes to social media companies and the trust Canadians might have in them and their ability to prevent foreign interference. And we're going to hear from Facebook in just a few moments here on our program. What do they say about their trust in social media companies? Well, this is, on the one hand, yes, Canadians have some confidence in their government. They have less confidence in social media. 43% say they're not at all confident or not that confident in social media companies. And I use Facebook as the example in our survey, but there's others like Google and Twitter and LinkedIn to put in place protections to prevent interference by foreign countries or anyone really in our election. And I think the fact that only 5% are very confident strikes at the heart of the problem, both for these companies who are trying to demonstrate clearly. And I think Facebook, in following the guidelines that the federal government has put out in terms of managing content and creating a directory, on the one hand, they have to figure out how to do it. And on the other, I think they recognize that despite elections not generating that much revenue for them, they're very high-profile events that can cause problems. Right. And so Canadians are not completely sure that these companies are going to step up and be able to do anything about it. But I think the companies will recognize that they need to be seen as caring and doing something about it because the public's concerned. Right. And so in some ways that might help the issue if the public feels that, look, I'm not sure I trust the social media companies to be able to deal with this, so I'm going to be even more careful about what it is I'm looking at on social media platforms, maybe with the view that I want to know who's trying to connect with me here and what's their motivation, because I'm not sure
the social media companies have been able to do that for me.
At the very least, I think you're right. At the end of this process, after 2 years, 3 years of talking about foreign government interference, social media, technology, I think we do have a public who is much more vigilant, much more aware of these issues. And I think the hope is that converts into more thoughtful behavior on social media, a more diligent eye. And we won't know for sure, but it does mean it's probably harder today to influence somebody on social media than it was perhaps 2 years ago when people may not have thought this was something that was happening.
All right, David Coletto, good to see you again, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
Thanks, Peter.
So David's numbers show clearly that Canadians are concerned about foreign actors trying to influence the election campaign. They show that Canadians have a fairly high level of confidence in the ability of the federal government to prevent foreign interference. For social media companies, not so much. The majority of Canadians are not confident that social media companies can prevent foreign interference. In a moment, I'll speak with the man who leads Facebook's public policy efforts in this country. But first, some background on the new Elections Act and the rules for social media platforms. The federal government's new Elections Act, Bill C-76, outlines new rules for social media companies. Under the new legislation, websites including social media giants such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google must keep a registry of all political ads they sell and post, whether directly or indirectly. Facebook has announced that it will create an ad library, which will confirm the identity of advertisers before they're able to run election ads on the platform. The company has also created an advisory group that will consult the social media giant on political advertising and key election issues. Google opted to ban political ads entirely from the platform after the new legislation was brought into effect, saying it would be too difficult to comply with the legislation. Unlike Facebook and Twitter, Google sources their ads through an online auction process. Advertisers use Google's ad exchange system to bid on ads in fractions of a second to target users as their web page loads. Twitter has yet to announce its plans, but currently runs an ad registration system in the United States. Well, it's fair to say that elections around the world are now being won or lost in many cases on social media, and that's not an exaggeration. So let's drill down on the responsibility of social media companies to safeguard the election in this country. We've got one of the biggest social media companies in the chair today, Facebook. It's taken a lot of heat when it comes to protecting democracy, and it's going to be under the microscope again in the October campaign in this country. Kevin Chan is the global director and the head of public policy for Canada for Facebook, and he's with me today. Mr. Chan, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in to speak with me. Look, we know that Facebook's taken some of its lumps about foreign interference in different elections around the world and so on. What's your pledge to Canadians in the Canadian election?
Well, I think, like everybody else, we want the same thing. We want a free and fair election in October. And so we're doing our part, making significant investments in a number of fronts to ensure that we kind of do our part to ensure that we do have those kinds of elections.
You've heard a lot of the criticism from politicians in this country about the actions of Facebook. What's your reaction to that Facebook really doesn't care? It's about bottom line. It's not doing enough to protect democracy. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think quite the opposite. In fact, we've been on this path for the last 2 years, making significant investments in people and in technology and in partnerships. To give you some examples, we've tripled the number of security people we have working on these matters at Facebook. So we went from 10,000 to 30,000 people. We've invested significantly in artificial intelligence to be able to try to proactively find all the fake accounts that we know are being used to try to deceive people and sort of perpetuate sort of bad behavior on our platform. And we have significant partnerships. We have partnerships with MediaSmarts in Canada, as well as with Agence France Presse on third-party fact-checking.
Okay, let's talk about you're now required, as the requirements of new federal election law, creating this registry of political advertising on Facebook. How will it work? What will be different?
Sure. So this law C-76 is actually very important and consequential legislation. It actually regulates online platforms. Mm-hmm. And what it requires us to do is, A, it requires us to make sure that we don't knowingly accept funds from a foreign actor seeking to advertise during the campaign period. It requires us to provide a function for advertisers to label who's paying for the ad. And then third, we have to actually put it into an ad library. So put the political ads in an ad library and we're going to hold it for 7 years.
Some people have said that you can't knowingly accept money from from third parties and so on. Why isn't it Facebook's responsibility to find out who's funding you? It does give you an out. The critics say that if the not knowingly part gives you an out on this. Why shouldn't you have to investigate where all the money's coming from?
Well, I'm glad you raised it. I mean, look, this is the will of Parliament that the law be structured that way. But we understand, I think, what the criticisms are, right? Which is that if you're a bad actor, you're probably not going to self-declare that you're going to do something bad on the platform.
Right.
And so actually what we've done is we're going to go over and above the law. We have an advisory group of very prominent Canadian leaders. They are going to be advising us on the issues that we think are going to be debated during the election. And using their knowledge and their foresight, we're building in new artificial intelligence systems to proactively try to block bad actors from trying to run ads if they don't self-declare. So I agree with you. In fact, what we're going to do is not only are we going to comply with the law, but we're going to proactively try to stop bad actors who are not going to declare this information to Facebook.
Let's talk about that advertising. Will Facebook reveal who the advertiser is micro-targeting? So in other words, which voters the ad sponsors are trying to reach?
So this is still being built right now, and in fact, our engineers and our product teams are really working right up to the wire, so basically the end of June, to get this done. So I don't have the specifications yet, but I think the intention is to give Canadians as much transparency as possible.
But that's an important thing, isn't it? Because in the past, we've seen organizations manage to find out Facebook's micro-targeting measures, and then Facebook took measures to block that. So their ability to find out who's being micro-targeted, isn't that the ultimate transparency, to be able to tell people, this is why the ad is coming to you. This is why they're after your opinion, or they're putting this in front of you, and this is what they're after.
So another way we're going above and beyond what C76 requires. So C76 doesn't require this, right?
No, it doesn't.
It simply just requires you to put this stuff these ads into an ad library. What we want to do is actually give Canadians, as you say, radical transparency into who this ad is reaching. So we're actually going to give you, hopefully, and again, I don't want to sort of be too definitive because we're still building it, but the idea is you're going to be able to see general demographic information about who this ad reached. You're going to get a range in terms of the ad spend. These things, I think, will be helpful, obviously, for Canadians, but I think also for folks like in the media.
But you've said it yourself, general transparency. I'm talking about micro-targeting specifically. Will I be allowed to know exactly who came after me and why? What it is they're after?
So I don't think anybody truly knows the intent of why someone's doing something. So that's, I think, important to underscore.
But I can decide that. If I know who it is and why they came to me, correct. I can probably figure out why they're after me.
And so on Facebook, you already do that. Yeah. You could already do that. We have this thing called ad preferences. And on any ad that you see on Facebook, you can actually click through and you can see why you were in the audience set. You can tell them that you don't ever want to see an ad from that person again, and you can actually also customize and say you only want to receive ads under certain categories.
Okay. You mentioned a little while ago the use of artificial intelligence to help try and weed out the bad actors. This was a problem already, and I want to raise we had the massacre of 50 people in New Zealand streamed online on Facebook, and the artificial intelligence failed to pick that up. My understanding is because it couldn't distinguish the live streaming of a real thing versus a video game. So I guess the challenge becomes, okay, how do we rely on artificial intelligence to be able to decipher who the bad actors are, and how does that happen?
Yeah, when we talk about automated systems, I think there are things that are, it's all relative. So there are certain things that are relatively easy to find, and then there are things that are much harder. So things that are, for example, separating between a good, regular person on Facebook, right, and somebody who is actually a fake account that's masquerading.
Or a botnet, or
sure, like a network of fake accounts. Right. It's much easier to make that distinction because real people don't behave the same way as fake accounts on Facebook. And so when you think about artificial intelligence, all it really is pattern recognition, as you're kind of suggesting. Right. So being able to figure out what are the characteristics of a real person on Facebook versus what a fake account is actually relatively easy to do versus content on Facebook that is moving, that has audio, that's constantly being re-edited. That's a much different kind of challenge.
Do you think you're in a position to say that the changes Facebook will make will actually safeguard the Canadian election, that if people are trying to interfere in the election, they won't be able to do it through your platform?
I think our hope is to make it so difficult that if you were a bad actor, you'd probably want to go do something somewhere else. I think what the reality is, this is a security problem. And if you talk to any security expert, the challenge will always be that as we evolve our systems, our adversaries will do the same. So I don't want to ever say and leave your viewers with the impression that our work will ever be done. But we do want to make sure that we are hopefully a few steps ahead, and that we make it so difficult for bad actors to try to do anything on the platform that they will seek to do it somewhere where there's less friction.
All right, Kevin Chan from Facebook. Good to talk to you. Hope we get a chance to talk again as the campaign unfolds.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Of course, our coverage this week is all part of our launch of the Democracy Project, a special initiative to encourage democratic literacy and engagement across the country with more than 24 partners, like-minded partners who want the same thing, to help encourage Canadians to participate and to learn more about the democratic process and how they can get involved. To find out more, go to our website, cpac.ca.
I think the biggest threat to democracy right now in Canada is people not being engaged.
I guess apathy, like people who don't get involved. I know that we've had some years where voter turnout's been really low, and I think it's important to do your research and know what's going on.
I guess people being power hungry and only thinking about themselves and what they want instead of everyone kind of deciding what's going to be best for us in the future.
I'm concerned with the media perspective, how media becomes so driven by current topics, how they want to put a spin on, I'm sorry folks, but how they put a spin on what seems to be fashionable or what seems to be popular.
Misinformation, I think, online, through social media, people not checking their sources.
Lack of nation building, lack of Canadian identity.
I vote in my municipal election because I understand where my vote is going, but if I was to vote in a provincial election, I would not know what was going on.
People need to be educated to learn to think about things critically, and I think without that, we're undermining democracy.
We see the freedom of expression being restricted more and more, like corporations controlling states. Even politicians don't even have the freedom to implement and to do what they want to do for the people that elected them.
Yeah, we do get a lot of special interests that try to sway things.
Probably the same as the United States, just the excessive divisiveness and xenophobia and just the fear-based panic, hysteria, rhetoric.
We cannot talk about the threats to democracy and the electoral process without talking about social media. That's where truth and trust are really being put to the test these days. The online revolution of modern times has given us a lot to be thankful for and a lot to question. It's become very clear that social media is a tremendous force for good, but also can be a tool for mischief and wrongdoing. You own something very valuable, and that's your opinion and the right to express it at the ballot box. And you will be faced with an onslaught of forces out there to shape your opinion. So what should you expect? Let's dig into that a little bit with my next two guests. Elizabeth Dubois, an assistant professor of communications at the University of Ottawa and a fellow at the Public Policy Forum. And Craig Silverman is the media editor of Buzzfeed and widely regarded as an expert in fake news. It's good to see you both. Thanks for coming in to talk about this. Let me start by asking you, how concerned each of you is about the possibility that this election campaign will be influenced largely through social media and what we should watch for. Elizabeth, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think that social media is definitely going to play a role in this election. We have already seen people ramping up, creating Facebook groups, Twitter campaigns. It's going to play a role. We need to remember that the vast majority of Canadians, while they are on social media, aren't necessarily trusting it as their main news source. So that gives us a bit of hope in terms of the fake news concerns. But we also know that there are foreign and domestic actors who are trying to be as innovative as possible when manipulating other people's opinions, and they're going to use every single tool in their toolbox to do that.
Craig, what's your view? How likely do you think it is that there'll be interference, and in what form will it take?
I would rate it as certainly much more likely than what we saw in 2015, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that the practice of social media manipulation, the practice of information operations is much more widespread now, and it's much better understood by people who might want to engage in it. And government's position on some things such as, Russia and other elements it might actually cause some foreign entities to have an interest in the Canadian election much more than we've had perhaps in previous years. So I think that it is something we should be watching for. It's something we should expect on a certain degree, but probably even more so than foreign interference. What's going to happen domestically is probably the biggest thing to pay attention to, I would say.
And in which way? What do you think is going to happen domestically?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that, of course, you have genuine partisan folks who really want to advocate for their party, for their point of view. And that is an important and legitimate activity when it comes to elections. But certainly, perhaps an economic or financial opportunity to dive in and try to stoke what are already divisions that exist. So I think that element of some people thinking, hey, maybe there's a little bit of money to be made here is one thing. And I do think, frankly, already we're seeing, particularly on Facebook, when it comes to groups and other sort of private or semi-private environments, we're seeing a lot of, some death threats against the Prime Minister and other people who are members of his party, and other things that are starting to well up that I think we'll start to see intensify even more as we get closer to October.
Elizabeth, do you think we need to worry more about foreign interference or domestic interference?
I think both are going to be an issue. We know that if you are not a fan of democracy, seeing chaotic democracies is a good thing in your perspective. And so the actors that have been involved in Brexit, in the US election, in France, we can expect that they're going to show up too. But like Craig said, I think the domestic one is where we have less of a grasp on what the possibilities are. We have less of a sense of how that's going to work, and we have less of a sense of how our existing electoral laws might apply and those regulations might play out.
Why does anybody want to interfere in a Canadian election? I mean, it seems like a very basic question, Craig. And I suppose let's look at the foreign side. Why does Russia care about interfering in a Canadian election? And I don't mean to malign Russia here, but we know something about the past. But why does anybody care about, to be colloquial, a little old Canadian election? What's the issue?
Well, I think there's two pieces to it. So one, just in general, as you say, not necessarily pick on Russia, but I think they've been at the forefront of trying to exert this kind of, influence through social media in other elections around the world. For them, if it's a member of NATO, if it's a leading member of the West, if they can disrupt or create chaos around an election and a perception of chaos around democracy, as Elizabeth said, that's a win for them. Specifically, though, Justin Trudeau has become a bit of an international icon for kind of liberalism, for that kind of, point of view. And so I think it's not just about Canada, it's about somebody who is a symbol around the world and who has built up a pretty big profile. Trying to bring him low, I think, is an appealing thing for some people out there. And so that is creating perhaps international interest that might not have been there in the past.
What do you think of that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would agree. I'd also add on, think about the timing of our election compared to the next U.S. election. This could be a good place to test out different techniques and tools and to
right. If your target's really the U.S. election, let's run a test on Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Look, I've kind of framed a question for myself as we head into the election campaign to sort of keep me vigilant when I consider content coming from, I guess, largely social media. And I guess it's this, is I'm going to ask myself every time, how do I know who's talking to me? Is that a good approach, Craig, or is that a little bit paranoid?
No, I think that's, when you think about fundamental advice for the average person, asking about the source, considering the source and considering, why this particular message might be reaching you and what they're trying to get you to do or get you to think is important. It's about taking that extra little step back and thinking of the context. So the source is, who is talking to me? What do I know about this person, this website, this particular source here is really, really important. And the other thing that I would add for the average person is to realize you do have a fair amount of power there. You're somewhat powerless at times, but by choosing what to like, choosing what to retweet or share, you are actually kind of making a small vote in some way. And over time, as more and more people make those decisions, it can have an effect. So think about guarding your attention, think about thinking of the source, and think about choosing when to share, when to react to something, and when not to, so that you can sort of control how much exposure it gets.
Elizabeth, does this heighten the role for traditional media in this election campaign? What role can it play?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. When we look at the sources of information that people report still trusting, traditional media comes out ahead of social media. Even though people are using social media to get political information, traditional media is often the place they go to check something that they've seen. So as we're talking about be vigilant, try and understand what the source is, we can also be saying find sources that you think are trustworthy, make sure that that's true, and then use them a bit of a benchmark against the things you're seeing come across social media. Because social media is designed to give you more of what you already are likely to like and share and retweet. And so if you're actually going off of social media to check things and to verify, that can help.
Let me finish on this for the question for both of you. If there are people who can be exploited, Craig, by content on social media, doesn't that suggest a certain vulnerability? And my question is, why does social media find that audience in this country? Why is there an audience for this kind of information, disinformation? It would seem to suggest, to at least some degree, there's a level of dissatisfaction with our democracy, and so there's an audience for the disruptors. Is that fair?
I think one of the factors that's taking place here, of course, is that it's a much more participatory medium. And so the views that might be on the fringe or on the edge that don't get much airing in mainstream media, people can coalesce around them on social media. And so, yes, I think you can see some of the fault lines that exist, and they start to be accentuated much more. And people who are like-minded come together. And one of the things that happen is kind of a group polarization dynamic where, the more you're surrounded by people who have the same point of view, the more extreme your views tend to get. And so we see that play out again and again in social media. So yeah, sometimes it can sort of give you a sense of the undercurrent that maybe you don't see in everyday life. But I also think people need to kind of guard on that and not necessarily think that just because you see people talking about something on social media that it's a widespread view.
How should you consider that kind of, when you see that kind of content, that kind of reaction, Elizabeth? What kind of weight do you give it? As Craig says, be careful about how many people we're talking about. But it does seem to suggest that this can be a gathering place for people who don't think democracy works for them.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that the people who share disinformation aren't necessarily saying they agree with it or even that they're upset by their democratic system. People like and share and repost things that are sensational, that are surprising, that go against what their expectations were. Sometimes they share it just for fun, for laughs, not because they necessarily agree with it. So thinking about counting up how much disinformation there is, even if we could get a good count on it, which is difficult, but even if we could do that, that's not a great measure of how satisfied people are with their democratic system. Definitely, it's something that we need to pay attention to and dig more into, but I'm wary of that sort of, oh, well, we see it, so it must be how people feel.
All right, lots to consider in your comments today. Craig Silverman, Elizabeth Dubois, thank you both for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So let's be clear, democracy isn't only threatened by outside forces, it can also wither from within if Canadians decide it doesn't work for them. The latest report card from the Samara Centre for Democracy suggests there is reason to be concerned. Samara is a national, non-partisan charitable organization dedicated to making Canadian politics more accessible, responsive, and inclusive. It's also one of our key Democracy Project partners. Michael Morden is the research director for Samara and joins me now from Toronto. Michael Morden, first of all, thanks for taking time to speak with me. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Peter. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Your report card gives the state of Canada's democracy this time around as a B-. How did you determine that grade?
Well, we have an index that looks primarily at three things: how Canadians communicate about politics, that means talking about politics with one another and talking to our elected representatives, how we participate in politics in the myriad ways that are available to us beyond voting, and then what we think of the quality of our political leadership. And we build a scale which is designed specifically so that we can observe the small changes in the health of Canada's democracy so we can provoke improvement and also see where we're starting to slip.
Okay, how does a B- compare to the last report card?
Last report card was also a B-. So the overall result turned out the same, which masked some sort of fairly positive trends and also some areas of concern.
Okay, what are some of the warning signs?
Sure. Well, the first thing that kind of jumped out at us is we asked, actually for the first time, if Canadians felt that their democracy was getting stronger or weaker. Nearly half said weaker, a much smaller number said stronger. Some said they didn't know. So that's an indication that Canadians are watching developments with great concern and have some concern about our future.
How do they feel it's being weakened?
We didn't probe too deeply. You know, there's some positive signs as well. Canadians seem to be tuned in ways that they haven't been in the past, but there's still ongoing disaffection, which is nothing new. We haven't seen dramatic change in how we evaluate our parties and MPs. In some cases, we're actually a little bit more satisfied than we were a couple of years earlier. Nevertheless, I think there's a sense that the quality of leadership is lacking in certain instances. We're not hearing as much from our elected representatives, even as we're reaching out more. So while Canadians are tuned in and engaged and ready to participate, we have ongoing, long-standing grievances with our political leadership.
Okay, let's drill down on a couple of these kind of measurements.
Sure.
You found 73% of Canadians reported having a discussion about politics in the last year. And that number's been rising from report card to report card. Why does that matter?
You know, that's sort of that's the social building blocks of a democracy. We don't do democratic politics by ourselves in our basement. We have to hear from one another. It's also just a very simple direct indicator of the extent to which we're paying attention and care. So to be frank, we were surprised at the magnitude of that improvement, and that's a fairly positive thing. It's up, you know, it was down around 60% of Canadians around this time prior to the last federal election, which actually saw more participation than we've seen in a while. So that to me is one of the most encouraging signs.
A growing number of Canadians, although still less than half at 42%, say they contacted an elected representative in the last year. Why is that important?
Well, for our elected representatives to go, you know, speak on our behalf, reflect our values and our priorities, they need to hear from us, and citizens have some responsibility there. Now, it needs to be a good two-way conversation. We can get to that. But the first step is citizens need to reach out. And again, there's a jump there that frankly surprised us.
Okay, you talk about the two-way conversation. There seems to be not quite as much love coming the other way here. 54% of Canadians say they were contacted by a party candidate or MP in the last year, but 46% say they received no contact at all in 2018. What does that tell you?
Yeah, there's been a real drop-off on that front, which is sort of curious. We asked Canadians a whole bunch of different methods by which MPs can reach them: email, social media, phone, in person, and in every category, Canadians are reporting less contact. So MPs have a responsibility too to reach out, to hear from us, to make that effort, to meet us halfway, and also to communicate what work they're doing in Parliament. That's really sort of fairly essential in bringing citizens along. So something's happened there in the last couple of years. We can't diagnose it, but it's an area of concern, something to watch.
What do people think of the work of their members of Parliament?
Canadians are marginally more satisfied than they were when we first started asking, which is interesting given conversations, for instance, around populism. There's nothing in our data to suggest that Canadians have suddenly and dramatically, you know, turned away from our institutions and our political leaders. You know, the change, if it's been positive, has been very, very modest. But we also probed a little bit deeper, asked citizens what they think MPs are good at and not so good at. And I think Canadians nailed that one. They suggested MPs are, or more Canadians think MPs are good at reflecting the views of their parties. Significantly fewer Canadians think MPs are good at reflecting the views of their communities.
And if there's a problem for our democracy long term, part of it lies there, doesn't it? If there's this sense that it's essentially a trickle-down process, that it comes from what they're doing in Ottawa down to the constituents and not the other way around, not the concerns going the other way, that could be a problem, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think, you know, that's sort of planting the seeds for long-term disaffection of a very serious kind, which would cause Canadians to question whether or not it's even worth their turning up to participate.
You also found out Canadians are concerned that the House of Commons is not reflecting the changes in the Canadian population and Canadian society. What did you see, and why are people feeling that way?
Well, along with asking Canadians, we also took a look at the extent to which Parliament reflects the diversity of the Canadian population. We were able to use 2016 data, which shows that the House of Commons is lagging. I mean, we know that women are obviously systematically and consistently underrepresented. Visible minorities, Indigenous peoples, foreign-born Canadians are all occupy fewer shares, a smaller share of the seats of the House of Commons than their share of the population. So there's a chance for Parliament to catch up in 2019, but Canadians perceive that lag, and that has a number of consequences.
Okay, let's quickly go through your recommendations here, three of them, three main ones. Strengthening and the collective and democratic skills and habits. How do we do that?
I think there's any number of ways. We called earlier in the year for more investment in civic literacy. That's the kind of knowledge and skills that's necessary for good democratic citizenship. It's more than just, you know, the old grade 10 civics class where you learn about 3 orders of the state, et cetera. It's about learning about how to find yourself in the political world, how to make a difference, how to pursue change. And you can do that in classrooms, but you can also do that through investment in adult education as well.
Okay. Number 2, equipping government institutions for better decision making. How does that happen?
There's a whole number of things we need to do to make our parliament a little bit healthier. You know, despite reasonable satisfaction amongst Canadians, we're not satisfied with how Parliament works. And there's no single fix, there's no silver bullet. It's a lot of little tweaks that can empower MPs to actually be that independent representative that can reflect the views of their constituents.
All right, let's finish on this. And this is an important one, almost an immediate call to action here at this moment in time. Making elections a moment for genuine deliberation. Tell me more.
We need a certain level of civility, a constructive discourse. We need parties to present platforms that are substantive, that are costed, amongst other things, so that Canadians are given a meaningful choice in the fall. You know, there are lots of signs of a promising democratic moment in 2019, from the fact that Canadians are talking about politics, the fact that they're more interested in politics than they've been in the recent past. But there's no guarantees that we're going to realize the potential there unless leaders, parties, candidates give Canadians allow Canadians to believe that they have a meaningful choice to make.
All right, Michael Morden from Samara. Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks so much.
And you can find out more about our Big Five series and the Democracy Project by going to our website at cpac.ca. Our series, The Big Five, Trust, Truth in 2019, What to Watch For in this election year, continues on Wednesday, when we'll focus on the party leaders, their policies, their challenges, and where they stand with the voters. I'm Peter Van Dusen. This is Primetime Politics. Thanks for watching.